Some nights, she sat on that porch whispering his name to the wind, believing love could stretch across prison walls. But when that black truck rolled down the dusty road, it carried more than just a man. It carried a storm. The mug slipped from her hand. The porch went still, and every promise they ever made hung heavy in the air like thunder that just wouldn't break. Folks say the heart can wait, but it don't always get what it's waiting for. And that was the night whispers turned into a story the whole town still leans in to hear. The night Josh was arrested, the sky broke open like a grieving heart. Thunder rolled slow, like a drumbeat that wouldn't stop. Natalie stood on the porch, barefoot on the old wood, clutching the thin shawl around her shoulders. Blue and red lights splashed against the white walls of the house, and neighbors peeked through half-closed curtains. Josh stood there in handcuffs, his eyes steady on her, like he was trying to tell her something without speaking. She wanted to run to him, but two officers held him on either side, firm as trees. "I'll wait for you," she whispered, though he was too far to hear. Her voice cracked like dry wood in a fire. He nodded once, slow, like a man swallowing his fate. The car door closed with a heavy thud, and the night swallowed him whole. Natalie stood there long after the lights were gone, her feet growing cold, her heart heavier with each passing minute. Folks said he'd be gone a long while. Some said he deserved it. Some said love don't survive iron bars. But Natalie didn't listen to any of that. Every week she wrote him letters, neat and careful, like each word mattered. She told him about the trees blooming again, about the small things in the house, about how she missed his laugh that always came too loud. She waited for replies, sometimes weeks late, but when they came, she held those letters like treasures. Time moved slow, like thick syrup on a cold morning, but her hope stayed alive, bright as the lantern she left burning by the window every night, just in case he looked her way again one day. The first year was the hardest. Folks whispered when she passed. Some pitied her, others judged her. A few smiled the way people smile when they think they know a story better than the one living it. Natalie kept her head high. She walked to the post office every Tuesday like clockwork. Her letters folded neat, her heart folded neater. On Sundays, she sat on the same porch with Mama Jo, the old woman next door, who fanned herself slow and hummed hymns between words. "You sure 'bout waitin' on that boy?" Mama Jo would ask, not with judgment, but with the softness of someone who's seen too much life. Natalie would nod. "He's not just that night. He's more than his mistakes." Mama Jo would purse her lips, then say, but the world don't always let a man be more than his worst day." Natalie didn't argue. She just kept waiting. She worked 2 jobs, fixed up the little house, painted the walls white again, and made the bed every morning as if he'd walk through the door any time. Sometimes at night, she'd pull out his old shirt and hold it close, breathing in the faint trace of him that never quite washed away. She told herself that love that runs deep don't drown easy. But when the second year came, and then the third, the letters grew thinner. His words were shorter, like he was folding himself away bit by bit. She told herself it was prison life making him quiet. But deep inside, a soft unease began to stir, like wind sneaking through cracks in an old house. It was on the 5th year, in the middle of a hot summer, that Natalie felt the first crack. He talked about a new job he'd gotten inside, some woodworking shop, and how he was keeping busy. He didn't ask about the house. He didn't mention missing her. It was as if he was writing to a distant cousin, not the woman who left her lamp burning every night. She read the letter 3 times, sitting on the porch, rocking slowly, cicadas buzzing loud like gossiping neighbors. Mama Jo looked over the fence and asked, "Bad news?" Natalie shook her head too quickly. "No, he's fine." But that night, when she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazy circles, her chest felt tight. She tried to remember his voice, but it sounded faint, like an echo down a long hallway. Still, she wrote him back. She wrote like before, full of warmth, full of stories about home. She told herself love needed faith, not fear. She pressed the envelope shut with trembling fingers, not knowing that love sometimes keeps walking even when one heart stays still. In the 6th year, Josh sent a photo. It was the first time he'd done that. It showed him standing with a group of other inmates, arms folded, looking tougher than she remembered. But her eyes caught something in the corner, a woman, not wearing inmate clothes, a volunteer maybe. She stood near Josh, smiling like summer. The woman's hand rested lightly on his shoulder. It was a small thing, maybe nothing, but Natalie's stomach knotted tight. She turned the photo over, searching for a note. There was none, just the photo. For 2 nights, she couldn't sleep. She stared at the picture like it held a secret she wasn't supposed to see. She told herself she was being foolish. She trusted him. She had to. But the mind can be cruel in the quiet hours. On the 3rd night, she folded the photo and tucked it under the loose floorboard beneath her bed. Out of sight, she whispered. Out of worry. But even hidden, it pressed against her thoughts like a thorn under skin. The day of Josh's release came after 8 long years. Natalie ironed her best dress, the yellow one with white flowers he once said made her look like a sunrise. She brushed her hair twice, baked his favorite pie, and placed it on the table like a welcome home sign. The whole house smelled warm, hopeful. Mama Jo came by and said, "You look like a woman waiting on a ghost to turn back to flesh." Natalie laughed softly. "He's coming home." She drove to the prison gates early, parked by the dusty road, and waited. Other families stood around, some nervous, some excited, some quiet. When the gates opened, her heart beat fast, like it had been saving all its energy for this moment. And then she saw him. Josh walked out, leaner, harder, but familiar. Her breath caught. But before she could run to him, a woman stepped out beside him. The same woman from the photo. She carried his bag like she'd been doing it for a while. Josh's eyes met hers. And something in them, something quiet, unreadable. Natalie froze on the spot. The woman beside Josh held his bag like it belonged there. She was tall, with soft brown curls and a bright smile that looked too comfortable. Josh walked toward Natalie slowly, like someone approaching a door they weren't sure they should knock on. "Natalie," he said, his voice rough, like gravel under boots. She forced a smile. "You're home." "Yeah," he said. Then he turned to the woman. "This is Clara." Clara reached out her hand, bright and confident. "Hi. I've heard so much about you." Natalie shook her hand, though her fingers felt like they didn't belong to her. The air grew heavy. Other families hugged, cried, laughed. But here, between the 3 of them, silence pressed in thick like a humid night. Josh cleared his throat. "Clara helped me a lot inside. She's part of a program." Natalie nodded slowly, her smile tight. "That's nice." She wanted to ask why Clara was standing so close. She wanted to ask why Josh's eyes flicked toward her like someone checking for permission. But she swallowed it. "Come on," she said, forcing cheer. "Let's get home." In the car, Josh sat in the front, Clara in the back. Natalie kept her hands steady on the wheel, but inside, everything shook. The road stretched ahead, but it didn't feel like the same road she'd driven for 8 years. Something had shifted, something she couldn't name yet. The house looked just like it did the day Josh left. Natalie made sure of it. She'd kept everything in place, even the creaky porch chair he used to fix but never did. She thought he'd smile when he saw it, maybe laugh. But when Josh stepped inside, he just looked around slowly, like a man walking through someone else's memory. "It smells the same," he said. Natalie waited for warmth in his voice. It didn't come. Clara followed behind him. Clara visited often. Too often. She said she was helping Josh adjust. She brought him books, sat with him on the porch, sometimes stayed late. Natalie told herself it was harmless. But every laugh between them sounded like a nail in the wall of her heart. One evening, Natalie finally asked, "Josh, who is she to you? Really?" Josh paused, jaw tightening. "She's someone who was there for me when you couldn't be." The words hit like a slap. "When I couldn't." "Josh, I don't mean it like that," he cut in. "You wrote letters. That's different." But Clara, she was there. In real time. Every day. Natalie stared at him. I waited 8 years. I know, he said, not meeting her eyes. And I'm grateful. But people change, Nat. That night, she sat alone on the porch, the lantern burning low, cicadas buzzing like a chorus that wouldn't let her think straight. She whispered to the night, what happens when love waits, and the person it waits for ain't the same? Natalie tried to fight for him. She cooked his favorite meals, wore the yellow dress again, brought out old photos, told stories about their early days. But Josh's laughter was thin, like a dry creek bed trying to remember rain. One Saturday afternoon, Clara came over with a box of tools. We're fixing the porch rail, she said brightly. Josh smiled at her like she'd hung the moon. Natalie watched as they worked side by side, sweat glistening under the sun, their movements in rhythm. She'd pictured this scene 100 times during the lonely years. Only Clara wasn't supposed to be there. Mama Jo walked up the path, arms crossed. Hum, she murmured. A woman can wait a whole storm out, only to find another settling on her porch when the rain clears. Natalie blinked back tears. What do I do? Mama Jo gave a small, sad smile. Child, sometimes The next morning, the house felt colder, though the summer sun poured through the windows. Josh left early without saying much. Clara didn't come by, but her absence didn't ease the tightness in Natalie's chest. She walked from room to room, touching things she had cared for all those years. His books, his jacket, the old record player they bought together. Everything still held a memory, but those memories felt like faded pictures now, curled at the edges. Mama Jo came over with her basket of laundry, like she always did when trouble brewed. She set the basket down, sat on the porch and fanned herself slow. You look like a woman standin' in the ashes of a house that ain't burned yet, she said. Natalie sat beside her. He said this isn't my house anymore. Mama Jo nodded slowly. A man can lose his way behind bars, but sometimes, it's when he steps out that you see what's left of him. Natalie pressed her hands together. I don't know if I've been waitin' for him, or for the memory of him. The porch creaked under their silence. The air smelled like rain that hadn't come yet. Natalie stared at the road, the same road she'd watched for 8 years, and whispered, I gave him everything, and now I don't even recognize the man walkin' through that gate. Mama Jo reached over and squeezed her hand. Child, love that don't grow with time, it grows away. Josh returned that evening with Clara again. They were carrying groceries, laughing like nothing had happened. Natalie stood at the doorway, not blocking them, just watching. Clara offered a small smile. Josh avoided Natalie's eyes. They cooked together in the kitchen, Josh chopping onions, Clara stirring a pot, while Natalie sat at the table, silent. She remembered those same motions years ago, when they were young and full of plans. But now it felt like watching strangers live in her home. After dinner, Natalie pulled Josh aside. We need to talk. Alone. Josh sighed but followed her to the back porch. The night was quiet, heavy with the hum of crickets. Josh, what are we doing? She asked softly. I waited 8 years. I held this house together. I believed in us. But since you came back, you've been somewhere else. Josh leaned against the railing, looking away. Prison changes you, Nat. I don't know how to fit here anymore. And Clara helps you fit better than I do? He didn't answer right away. She understands what I went through. Natalie's voice shook. I was out here fighting for a future. You were in there fighting to survive. But we were supposed to meet in the middle. Josh looked at her finally, and his eyes held a tiredness she'd never seen. Maybe our middle ain't the same anymore. The words fell between. Clara hesitated. I never meant to hurt you. Josh and I, we didn't plan this, but we grew close. I was there every day when he was trying to hold on. I know it doesn't make this easier. Natalie stared at her. You walked into a story that was already being written. Clara lowered her gaze. And he let me. Natalie's voice steadied. Then this isn't about what you meant. It's about what he chose. Clara nodded slowly and left the box on the porch. Inside, Natalie found old letters Josh had written but never sent. Most of them were to Clara. Natalie sat on the porch long after Clara left, the box of letters open on her lap. She read them slowly, each word carving a deeper line in her heart. Josh had written about his fears, his anger, his loneliness. But he'd also written about how Clara's visits made the days bearable, about how her voice reminded him of freedom. He wrote about missing Natalie too, but those words were fewer as the letters went on. The last letter ended with, "I don't know who I'll be when I get out, but I know Clara understands the man I've become." Natalie pressed the paper to her chest, her tears falling quietly onto the ink. For years she had held on to a version of Josh that existed in her mind. But the man who wrote these letters was someone she didn't know. Mama Jo found her there and sat down beside her without a word. Sometimes silence speaks louder than comfort. Natalie whispered, "I kept the light on for a man who already walked toward another flame." Mama Jo nodded slowly, her fan tapping against her knee. "Child, sometimes you gotta turn off that porch light and close the door. Not out of anger, but out of mercy for your own soul." The next day, Natalie decided she couldn't live in the in-between anymore. She cleaned the house from top to bottom. Like a woman preparing for a storm, she wasn't going to hide from this time. She folded Josh's clothes, packed them into boxes, and lined them neatly by the door. When Josh came home that evening, he found her sitting on the porch, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The night after Josh left, the house felt hollow, like someone had taken the heartbeat out of it. Every room carried his shadow, on the walls, in the corners, in the quiet places where laughter used to live. Natalie sat on the porch, rocking slow in the old chair, listening to the night hum. The lantern burned low, soft and warm, not for him this time, but for herself. Mama Jo walked over, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "Well," she said, lowering herself into the chair beside Natalie, "looks like the storm finally passed." Natalie gave a tired smile. "Storms don't always leave puddles. Sometimes they leave cracks." Mama Jo nodded. "Cracks can let light in, if you let them." For the first time in years, Natalie didn't check the road. She didn't stare down the path, waiting for headlights. She looked up instead, at the stars scattered wide across the dark, like someone had thrown a handful of bright seeds into the sky. She whispered, "I don't know what comes next." Mama Jo's fan tapped against her knee. "Then you're standin' at the start, not the end." The porch creaked under their quiet, and for the first time in a long time, that quiet didn't hurt. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers around town shifted. Folks who once pitied her now looked at her with curious eyes. Some were surprised she'd let him go. Others admired it. A few still whispered that she'd waited too long for nothing. Natalie didn't care anymore. She started fixing up the house. Not for him, but for herself. She painted the porch a deep, rich blue. She replaced the lantern with a brighter one. She planted flowers along the walkway, the kind that opened wide at sunrise. She took a job at the local library, something she'd always wanted but never had time for. In the quiet rows of books, she found a kind of peace that waiting had stolen from her. Sometimes Josh drove by. Once or twice he stopped, standing at the edge of the porch like a stranger at the door. They spoke politely, carefully, like two people handling fragile glass. Clara was with him sometimes, sometimes not. But Natalie no longer shook when she saw them. She didn't owe him pieces of herself anymore. Mama Jo watched her from across the fence one morning and said, "You're startin' to sound like your own song again." Natalie smiled. "Feels strange." Mama Jo nodded. "Strange is just the space between what was and what will be." One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft oranges, Josh came to the porch alone. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, his shoulders slumped. "Can I sit?" he asked. Natalie gestured to the chair beside her. "It's still a chair," she said simply. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crickets. Finally, Josh spoke. "I messed it up." Natalie looked straight ahead. "We both changed, Josh. It's not about blame anymore." He leaned forward. "I thought I'd walk out and everything would fit back like before. But Clara, that was a part of me in there. And you..." Natalie's eyes softened but didn't waver. I spent 8 years thinking about us. And then I realized I forgot to think about me. He nodded slowly, pain flickering across his face. I never meant to lose you. You didn't lose me, Josh, she said gently. You just didn't come home to where I stayed. They sat quietly as the lantern flickered. Two people who had once shared everything, now sharing only the night breeze. Word around town spread that Clara had moved to the next county. Some said she got a new job. Others said she couldn't handle the tension between Josh and Natalie. Josh didn't talk about it. He still came by sometimes, fixing a loose rail or bringing groceries. But the air between them wasn't filled with old promises anymore. Just quiet understanding. One Saturday, Natalie joined the town's summer fair for the first time in years. She wore a simple white dress, her hair loose, and walked through the stalls with a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. She laughed with neighbors, danced with children, and for the first time, she didn't look over her shoulder to see if Josh was watching. At sunset, a man named Luke, who worked at the library with her, offered her a cup of lemonade. You look like someone who finally let the wind catch her sails, he said with a grin. Natalie laughed softly. Maybe I did. They talked under the fading sky, easy and warm, no heavy history hanging between their words. When Josh saw her across the fairground, talking to Luke, his eyes held something like regret, but also respect. For the first time, Natalie didn't feel like she owed him an explanation. As the season turned, Natalie's world kept growing. She hosted small porch gatherings with neighbors, taught children to read at the library, and filled her nights with stories, music, and her own quiet joy. Josh came by less often, not out of anger, but because their lives had finally found separate rhythms. One evening, he stopped by to drop off some tools and lingered on the porch. I'm leaving town, he said. Natalie looked at him, surprised. Where to? Starting a job a few counties over. Fresh start. She nodded slowly. That's good. He hesitated, then smiled faintly. You kept the light burning, Nat, even when I didn't deserve it. Thank you. Natalie met his eyes. I didn't keep it burning for you in the end. I kept it so I'd remember who I was. Josh's smile grew sad, but peaceful. I'll remember that. They hugged once, gently, like two people closing a long, hard chapter. And when he drove away, Natalie didn't watch the taillights disappear down the road. She turned toward the house, toward the life she was building. Not out of waiting, but out of living. The air that evening was thick with the smell of rain and regret. Natalie sat on the old wooden porch, her hands wrapped around a chipped blue mug. The cicadas sang their endless song, like they knew a storm was coming. Down the dusty road, the prison bus had taken Josh away 2 weeks earlier, leaving behind an empty chair, a cold bed, and a heart that refused to stop waiting. Folks in town whispered. They said a woman who waits for a man behind bars is like a candle in the wind, brave, but bound to flicker. Natalie didn't care. She'd promised Josh, under the shade of the big pecan tree by the river, that she'd wait, no matter what. Every night she wrote him letters she couldn't send. She'd fold them carefully and keep them in a biscuit tin under her bed. She'd imagine his voice reading them back to her, the same voice that once said, "Darlin', I'll come back to you." Her mama told her to move on. Her friends told her to forget. But Natalie's heart didn't take orders. It held on like an old oak's roots in a storm. She believed in the boy who held her hand at the county fair. She believed in the man who swore he was innocent. But deep down, in the quiet spaces between her breaths, fear was growing. What if prison changed him? What if time turned love into dust? She shook the thought away. She wasn't going to let doubt steal her nights. Not yet. The prison walls were taller than Josh remembered, and colder too. The clang of the gates behind him sounded like a final breath shutting off. The first week was a blur of stairs, orders, and silence. He kept his head low, counting the days. He thought of Natalie's laugh, of her fingers laced with his, of the promise he made under the stars. But each night, the darkness pressed heavier. There was a man named Clyde who ran things inside. He had a voice that could freeze blood. Clyde saw Josh and said, "You look like fresh paint on an old fence. Clean, but easy to scratch." Josh learned quick. He did favors. He kept quiet. Natalie walked into town every Friday to see the postman. She'd wear her best dress, the yellow one with tiny white flowers. She'd ask, "Any letter from Josh?" Even though she already knew the answer, the postman would shake his head, and her smile would fade just a little more each week. Folks noticed. Some pitied her, others mocked quietly. At the diner, an old woman named Pearl leaned over the counter. "Sugar, hope's a fine thing, but don't let it turn into a chain," she warned. Natalie just nodded. She'd rather be chained to hope than drift in emptiness. At night, she'd go down to the river and talk to the stars like Josh was listening. "I know you can't write back," she'd whisper, "but I'm here. I'll be here." The water carried her words away like secrets. She didn't know that, miles away, Josh was sitting in a cold cell, staring at her unopened letters, trying to remember who he was. 2 years passed. Seasons changed, people moved on, but Natalie stayed. Her hair grew longer, her laugh grew softer, but her faith stayed steady. Then one evening, a letter finally came. She held it like treasure. Josh wrote about the nights that swallowed him, the fights he avoided, and the dreams he held on to. He ended with, "When I get out, I'm coming home to you." Natalie pressed the letter to her chest. Felt like sunlight after endless rain. She ran to Pearl's diner and read it aloud, her voice trembling with joy. Pearl just smiled softly. "Letters are easy, sweetheart. It's the living after that's hard," she said. Natalie didn't care. She'd waited this long. She'd wait longer if she had to. Inside the prison, Josh had changed. The boy who once picked wildflowers for Natalie had learned to keep his fists tight and his heart guarded. But then came Lena. She worked in the prison library, a volunteer with eyes like quiet fire. She didn't ask questions. She just listened. Josh found himself talking to her about books, about freedom, about things he never put in letters. One day, Lena said, "When you get out, what's the first thing you'll do?" Josh hesitated. He should have said, "Go home to Natalie." But instead he said, "I don't know anymore." And that scared him more than any cell ever could. The morning Josh came home, the sky wore a quiet gray, like it knew something was about to shift. Natalie stood on the porch in her faded yellow dress, the one he once called sunshine stitched with thread. She'd polished the porch rails, baked his favorite cornbread, and told herself over and over, "He's coming back to me, to us." The road stretched long and empty, until a black truck rolled into view, kicking up a trail of dust. Josh stepped out slowly. He was broader, quieter, like time had carved something new into him. For a heartbeat, Natalie saw the boy she used to know. Her heart raced, her hands shook. But then the passenger door opened, and Lena stepped out. Her hair flowed in the wind, her eyes calm but sure. She walked toward Josh like someone who already had a place beside him. The mug Natalie held slipped from her hands and shattered on the porch. Josh looked up then, saw her standing there, saw the pieces fall. He opened his mouth, but words tangled in the air between them. The whole town saw. In places like this, news travels faster than wind through cornfields. Pearl leaned on the diner window, watching as Lena carried a suitcase while Josh trailed behind. Unsure, heavy with silence. Natalie didn't run. She didn't scream. She just stood, her fingers gripping the porch rail, holding herself steady like a tree refusing to bow. Inside, her mind replayed every letter, every promise, Every night she whispered to the stars. She remembered his words, "I'm coming home to you." But now home had a stranger's shadow. Josh climbed the porch steps slowly. "Nat," he started. "Don't," she said, her voice soft but sharp enough to cut. "You already said enough. Years ago." The wind carried his... The next day, Lena came by alone. She stood by the fence, hands folded, eyes clear. "I'm not here to steal anything," she said. "He found comfort with me when the world closed in. But I see the way he looks at this place. At you." Natalie studied her. There was no malice, just truth. Lena wasn't the villain. Life was. Time was. Silence was. "Then why are you here?" Natalie asked. "To give him a choice," Lena said softly. "Not because he owes it, but because love without choice ain't real love at all." Then she turned and walked back toward the truck, leaving behind the scent of honesty and rain. That evening, the porch light flickered on. Josh stood before her, no longer with excuses, but with a question hanging heavy between them. "Nat, if there's a way to fix this, to find us again, I want to try. But I understand if the door's closed." Natalie looked at him for a long moment. She saw the man who left, the man who came back, and the years that built a bridge between them. Her heart didn't leap, it listened. She stepped closer, placed the biscuit tin in his hands. "These are the letters I wrote when I still believed we were frozen in time," she said. "Read them. If you still see us in those words, then maybe we can talk. But not before." Josh nodded, tears tracing lines down his face. Lena watched from the truck, then quietly drove away, leaving him on the porch with the woman he once called home. The night hummed with cicadas. Somewhere a storm was clearing. Natalie turned back inside, not slamming the door, not opening it wide, just leaving it ajar. And for the first time in years, the wind carried not just waiting, but possibility.